So thank you. We've had three interesting presentations then, starting from the sort of the very futuristic, forward-looking, to Ghana with a risk of losing thousands of manufacturing jobs, huge informal sector. Again, construction as a growth sector, and now in Vietnam, the mention of glimpses of some of these technological trends. So the e-commerce story, I suppose getting investors like Intel is also part of that. But also this large public sector and the difficulties in trying to disengage from these state-owned enterprises. And I think it's also interesting your point about cheap labor, given what we were talking about, is if their sort of driving force is still the cost of labor, and we're talking about sort of decent jobs, then it kind of brings that one back into the fore again. I'm interested actually by the point about the lack of business accounting and auditing skills. I think that, to my mind, that's something that's often overlooked, and maybe in the next session we can also talk about the role of those things in promoting sort of firm level issues. And finally, I think an interesting point there about the sort of the need for responsive systems. So these are sort of evolutionary processes. So it's not so much that we need to have system set up to address current gaps, but already being able to actually have the system to be able to change while the gaps change is also going to be important. So this we now have considerably more time this time for sort of question and answers. If there are comments or thoughts that you want to put to the floor, and I maybe even have a couple from online, but maybe if we can take some from the floor first, if there's any clarifications, questions, points. Yes, here.
Brendan Martin, Public World. Just a quick clarification on the numbers in Vietnam, state-owned enterprises. I think you said 10%?
10% of the workforce employed in state-owned, well, government and state-owned enterprises.
Okay, so that's what I was going to ask. What is the breakdown between government and state-owned enterprises? Do we know that?
I don't know. The figures vary. One figure was 1,500 state-owned enterprises. Then by the time we finished the study, somebody told me there were 5,600. And I think a lot of that depends on local government owning enterprises, army owning enterprises, women's union owning enterprises, all kinds of things. So I think those figures, I'm afraid, I don't have further breakdown.
Okay, can I just, while I have this in my hand, just following up some of the points that came up at the end of the last session, particularly that Rolf brought up. We haven't heard very much today about the political economy of employment policy and job creation policy. And I wonder, in the cases of all the country cases that we've discussed, what observations there might be about from that point of view, about some of the research data that's been presented today.
Okay, yep, that's a good question. We have another. We'll take two or three at the same time, and there's an the gent at the back there. Yeah.
Tom Sanderson, BBC Media Action. Glowin from Ghana mentioned that the way people are getting jobs is changing, and it sounded, if I understood correctly, that there's a movement more towards advertising vacancies and using agencies and so on, which from our Western standpoint is kind of what we're used to, but that's different from the old, as it were, system of recommendations. May I ask what's happening in Vietnam, how people are applying and getting jobs? Is it a mixture of that, and is there a move perhaps to e-bulletin boards and vacancy boards online and so on?
Okay, so we can maybe let's take one more just at the back, and then we can...
Renato Goodfellow, BT. Can I ask if electricity generation being reliable and also access to communications are seen to be vital enablers? And in the latter case, are you seeing more focus on where is the universal service obligation going and it embracing internet access? Thank you.
Okay, so we have three questions, one quite varied. One on the political economy of employment and job creation. The second on the way that people are getting access to jobs and the way that this is taking place. And then the third in terms of electricity, communication, internet access, whether these are seen as key issues. Maybe is Glowin still here?
Yes, I am.
Would you like to take a go at one or two of those questions? Particularly on the political economy, perhaps, since you mentioned that yourself.
Actually, I didn't get a question on the political economy. Can you please repeat that for me?
Sorry,
Hello?
it was basically asking, saying that one of the points that hasn't been discussed very much today is the political economy behind job creation. So the actual interest
Okay.
and the drivers at a government level, or political pressure for governments to actually design and implement the policies to create jobs.
Okay, yeah, I'd like to comment on that. Actually, in Ghana, that is quite a challenging thing because most of the, when you have say you have a construction company that has started doing some infrastructure building, they're building a bridge, they're building a road connecting different parts of the country. If that the owner of that company is connected to a political party and they're taking that job, when another political party comes into power, it starts becoming very reluctant to continue with that person who started the project. Meanwhile, there are a number of people, hundreds of people that are employed through that. So that is a big challenge in Ghana, their political challenges, because they try to politicize every government, a piece of work that is given by the government. But when a piece of work is given by a private enterprise, you do not have political interference. So that is a big challenge in Ghana. The next thing I'd like to comment on is the electricity, and technology. I think in the last year we have had severe challenges with our electricity in Ghana. So we have load shedding, and that is really affecting jobs and the economy, because a lot of small-scale industries that employ so many people across the country are closing down because they cannot afford to pay for generators. They can't afford to run generators over the entire week or a percentage of the week. So that is creating a lot of challenges in Ghana now. The government promises to work on electricity prices within the year, but it's been over a year now since we started this crisis and nothing seems to be improving.
Okay,
Can
thank
I
you.
just add something on Ghana? I think in terms of the political economy of Ghana has been very interesting that the government is desperately trying to fight the economic crisis right now and the fall down of the cedi. So that's where most of their effort is at the moment. The Ghana Poverty Reduction Strategy papers 1 and 2, they both address the issue of job creation and employment. But obviously, due to the current economic situation, that attention has been completely diverted to trying to set up the deal with the IMF that just came through last month. So now we will see whether they refocus their attention or not on furthering this agenda.
Okay, so actually the government is focusing more, the pressure is more to focus on macroeconomic issues again,
right
so it's a
now.
little bit what we heard this morning as well in Sri Lanka. The way people get jobs?
Sure. Basically, in the state sector, you buy them, I think. It's about 100 million dom, apparently, to buy your position in a commune health clinic. And, throughout the state-owned enterprise sector, you buy your job. It's pretty brutal, but that is the case. They're not advertised. In fact, I think there was some case where they advertised the job for Minister of Education just as a sort of window dressing thing, and various people applied and failed to get it. But anyway, in the private sector, there are lots of there are job placement centres which cater for about, I think, receive about 10. Ho Chi Minh City receive about 10% of actual vacancies that go out there, and the Ministry of Labour is trying to improve information in the job market so that people can get jobs through standard job placement centres like that. There are 2 or 3 internet, whatever, digital means of advertising for jobs, primarily in the major cities and in the private sector. But as you could see, that there is 80% of employment still within the informal sector, which obviously isn't covered there. So that I think is the situation with regard to job application. If I could just say a couple of things on the political economy as well, that would be great, because you're not allowed to say these things in Vietnam, so it's nice to have the opportunity to do it here.
They might be watching.
Well, I'm sure they are. No, they know full well. There's nothing too controversial here. But first is that this question of the SOEs is important, because it does mean that things like land and credit and other factors of production that are so important for the private sector offer them, the state-owned enterprises are getting preferential access to those resources, which does mean that it does stymie the development within the domestic organised private sector, and that is why I think that sort of contributes to this growing imbalance where there's a lot of growth in the foreign direct invested sector, partly because they have access to capital, because they have access to markets and all the rest of it, and also because the domestic private sector is still subject to imbalances, as I've mentioned. I think the other thing which is relevant to this also is that there is sensitivity about some of those reforms, which a lot of people, they all know that they need those sort of reforms in the education sector, but there are sensitivities about that because historically it is the Communist Party has controlled the education sector, and allowing people more flexibility, allowing colleges more flexibility in terms of what they teach and what subjects they teach to whom is a matter of sensitivity. A lot of people do spend quite a lot of time still learning about Marxism, Leninism in their vocational training course, and there is sensitivity about relaxing that and creating more flexibility and incentives to make the system more responsive to demand. So I think that is another issue which is one which is also important.
Yeah. Okay, now that's good. And I actually failed to take account of this thing in the first session, and there was a question which might be interesting for you and others about would there be a value in international standardization of TVET? So a lot of the stuff that we're talking about is to do with the training capacities, what you were just mentioning just now as well, about the kind of training that's actually taking place. You even suggested that, or mentioned that they would prefer not to have people who've been TVET trained. So is there a place, is there a role for that? That's one online question. Another rather long one. Has any research been carried out into the effects of increased employment levels in private and public sectors on the often vitally important traditional non-monetary social support and protection systems? So anything to do with social support and protection systems and employment effects, and especially the long-term effects when communities move away from informal labour. So if there's anything you can think of, sort of support, social protection, and has that had a role in Vietnam and Ghana? And what about the role of private and public sector in supporting the non-monetary value-based economies like the gift economy in Mali? So I'm not familiar with that, but if you have anything to say on the non-monetary gift economy, then you can mention it now as well. Are there any other questions here from?
Did I miss my answer?
Did you miss your answer?
I think Glowen addressed it but I can also touch on that, on the issue of electricity. As you know, Ghana has electricity days on and off, and everybody has a generator, and so that's it's a separate economy there. So that has become an issue. Like Glowen mentioned, it is an issue for the government. The government is trying to put investment towards a few electricity production projects. But what is very interesting is that despite this, Ghana is an ICT hub for Africa. So it's managed to overcome this challenge, or is at least moving forward despite. Glowen also mentioned in her presentation that there's 100% mobile penetration in Ghana, and internet penetration is quite high, I would say, given regional standards. So you also asked, there is an universal service obligation. Of course there is, and there is. I think there is a drive for that. But also, as I mentioned before, all efforts on the government side were put on stabilizing the economy right now. So everything else was out of the question. We had a conversation with about 20 different representatives from different areas of government in Ghana. They raised a lot of interesting issues, but they were also aware of the fact that until the macroeconomic situation was resolved, there was not going to be a space for another conversation. So now that, again, the IMF deal came through last month, we hope the government can release some of this pressure and start other conversations that are needed as well. I'm going to try to address the international standardization of TVET. TVET is a very interesting topic because it comes up every time there's employment crisis, and TVET is portrayed as a problem solver. We're going to just train people in these skills and they are all going to get jobs and the problem is solved. But TVET is extremely complex. There are a lot of issues about demands from the market. What are the skills that the private sector needs? How do we make sure they're aligned? How do we make sure they're working together? Just creating a national standardization program for TVET is a nightmare. There have been attempts of doing this by different sectors and industries, because we need to understand if somebody is getting a degree in Vietnam, does it mean that those are the same skills that somebody getting a degree in Ghana? And we don't know at this moment. We don't know how tradable in one way those skills are. It's going to be terribly complex to do that. There have been some efforts. UNESCO is one of the ones at the forefront of having these discussions. And by industry and sector, it's easier than just an overall blanket that is going to be just too broad and kind of like the same picture that we have right now, that is that we don't know what it means and we don't know what it stands for. So I would suggest if we want to standardize anything, we have to look at the sectors or industries and go deeper than that and be very specific about what we mean. Otherwise, it's just a waste of money and resources. And then we end up with this perception about TVET. However, what is very interesting is, despite the bad perception that TVET has in Vietnam and Ghana, in Vietnam, TVET graduates are likely to be employed a lot faster than college graduates and to earn more over a lifetime. The same applies in Ghana. Queuing for jobs, if you have a TVET degree, is a lot less time. You just get employed faster because your skills are more in demand. But there is a perception issue that TVET is a second-class citizen education for people who couldn't get into university, basically. So there has to be this broader discussion of, first, what do we mean by TVET? What are the skills that the market is requiring? How do we standardize that? And how do we align the needs across sectors?
Mm-hmm. Okay, now that's a very good complete answer also about the perception story again, which is what we heard from Sri Lanka. I think maybe we're going to wrap up this session, but perhaps, Glowin, did you have some final words, and perhaps maybe see about this question of social protection? Has social protection had a role in the employment outcomes in Ghana?
I think very recently, over the last 5 or 6 years, the government started accepting with the certain amount of money to really extremely poor people. I think the way in which it has benefited these poor people in mostly rural communities is that it targets those, especially single parent families with young children, and it gives the parents, the single parent, the ability to assist and send their children to school. So that is, but because this social protection intervention has been really short term, we haven't seen the long term benefits of that. But when you have these young people in rural communities getting the opportunity of entering into school, it will eventually end up with something that will affect the economy positively.
Question I was going to put to you, take the prerogative as chair. You were talking about, even in the state sector, people buying jobs. So effectively we have a proper labour market. You buy your job. Does it function as a relatively efficient market, or
well, no, it doesn't.
Is there in any way you could say that this is some sort of efficient mechanism, or not at all?
No, because basically once you've bought your job, then you have to find a way to recover the cost that you've invested in it, and that's one of the main roots of corruption. Is that once you've done that, then you need to find a way to cover the cost, and that's why corruption is so ingrained, I suppose, is that people have bought their job and they're not going to leave it until they've covered the cost of getting it.
So you buy the job in order to have access to the rents. Okay, do you have any final remarks, Claudia, or were there any... Rolf, actually, you had your hand up, and since you gave us some good remarks at the end of the last session, you can perhaps give us
I think that's related to the remarks William made, and maybe also for the next session, because you gave a quite pessimistic picture of the labor market situation in Vietnam. But if we look at the overall statistic in Vietnam, Vietnam belongs to one of the gazelles in the developing countries. So the question is, do we use still the same ways, or to look at Asian economy at Vietnam? Because I can understand when you work there. I've also worked in Africa. Sometimes you get very frustrated, corruption, etc. But if the macro picture is better than most of the other countries, the question raises is what are the societal system which drives such a good macro picture? And if we go back in history, when China started and had not started yet on its big programs, everybody condemned China for being backward and not being able to do it. And still they made it not based on our Western system of thinking, but on different ways of thinking. So I don't have an answer, but it's maybe something from the next session that we should look a bit at the macro performance and what we as individuals see at our macro level activities and interventions in the countries.
Okay, yeah, no, that's perhaps a good word to find, a good final word to end on for that session. Then we finish slightly earlier than, or slightly later, but we have sandwiches after the next session. So we've got one more session where the idea is to kind of try and draw some of these discussions together. Unfortunately, you're still going to have to deal with me because I'm now switching to presenter mode from chair mode. So thank you very much to the participants. Thank you very much, Gloin, for a good session.